Michelle is a professional touring front of house engineer with 30 plus years career, a 30 plus year career mixing major label recording artists including Elvis Costello, Gwen Stefani, Janet Jackson, the Goo Goo Dolls, Melissa Etheridge, Jewel Sticks, Mr. Big, and many more. She's the co-founder of soundgirls.org, a Full Sail University Hall of Fame inductee, and creator of mixinglivemusic.com, where she teaches mixing techniques. Michelle Sobolczyk-Petinado, welcome to Live Sound Summit.
Thanks for having me. And thanks everybody for showing up. I'm going to share my screen real quick here before we get started.
Yeah, and I'll just give you guys a heads up as Michelle's doing that she's going to kind of have a story, a throughput here. And so we'll be taking questions along the way. And then if she stops to take questions or she takes them at the end, she'll kind of let us know when she's going to do that. So we'll post in the link for that, and you guys can put up your digital hand and things like that. But yeah, we'll have that be a little bit more organized for this particular presentation.
Let me fix that real quick. I know how to do audio. I don't know how to do this stuff.
We'll have complaints about any complaint about how this production runs. I say, hey, I'm the sound guy. What are you going to
do? Okay. So for those of you who don't know me, like Nathan said, I started working in live sound in the late 1980s. And I did my first tour as a front of house engineer in 1992 with the band Spin Doctors. I've been touring full time as a front of house engineer ever since. And most recently, I was on tour with Elvis Costello up until the pandemic and anxiously waiting for it to be over so we can get back out there. But I've been doing this a long time. And I have to say that audio's come a long way over the past 20, 30 years. PA systems have gone from mountains of stacked individual components to lightweight, comparatively, point source arrays that can be aimed anywhere you like. Audio consoles have shrunk from heavy analog behemoths that grew in size relative to your channel count to compact digital desks that can pack over 100 channels into something that two people can easily lift. And taking a snapshot of your desk after sound check was literally a snapshot with a Polaroid camera, or manually drawing all of your settings on a couple sheets of notebook paper. We didn't have any recall back then, and it wasn't as simple as just loading your show file. So these days, there's line array calculator programs that tell you how to hang the PA in any venue. There's system optimization software and digital amps that can be controlled from front of house. No more crawling under the stage to adjust your amp racks. Digital consoles have gates and comps on every single channel. So you never have to decide if you're going to put the good compressor on your bass guitar or your lead vocal. You've got complete snapshot and recall capabilities and full automation. Some entry-level consoles even come loaded with presets for EQ. And you can carry your entire show on something this big and keep tweaking it until it's perfect, even on fly dates. And there is a plugin for everything under the sun. Your acoustic guitar doesn't sound so good? Well, throw on the Maserati acoustic plugin and voila. You need your mix to have more bite or more air? Slap on the Schoeps Parallel Particles plugin and just turn the dial. You know, we've really come a long way, but in all of this technological progress, it's very easy for the art of mixing to get lost. And for those of you who are just getting started in audio or who've only been mixing since digital consoles and on digital workstations, it can be very appealing to let the technology do the work. But this keeps you from growing as an engineer and improving your mixing skills. So today I'm going to talk about what my thoughts are on the tools that actually will make you better at mixing. And it doesn't involve the Waves Horizon bundle or UA Audio. You don't even need a computer. And the best part is they don't cost you anything. So just a quick heads up, if you're here expecting some super techie talk, you're in the wrong place. When it comes to mixing, I am all about the art of mixing, the craft. I'm not going to be talking transfer functions and phase coherence or scope readings or what plugins I use on my vocal signal chain. But what I will be talking about is how getting back to the basics can improve your mixing skills. And the benefit of this, of getting back to basics and getting the basics down, is that you can work with whatever you've got and still create a high quality mix. So, why is this important? Well, for anyone who's trying to get on tour as a sound engineer or to get a mixing gig, a huge part of your hireability is being able to troubleshoot and to be versatile enough to mix on whatever gear you've got. You know, your first touring gig with a band will likely be playing clubs and using local or in house production, unless you've already got a mixing gig with an artist who's moved beyond that. But what you're going to find is the range of gear that you'll be working on will be as wide as the range of quality. It's not uncommon to spend your first hour or so of the day troubleshooting and repairing problems with the house rig, whether it's blown speakers or phase problems, bad amp channels, wiring problems, faulty gear, whatever. You're going to need to be able to make it work and to mix the best show that you can. Today, you might be mixing on an M7CL, and tomorrow a Digico, the next day an H3000. But the key to being able to navigate all of this is having a solid grasp on signal flow. And signal flow is one of the basic fundamentals of live sound, and also being able to mix on whatever console you've got. You know, nothing improves your mixing chops like having to make a pile of junk sound good. So when the club owners start telling you that your mix was the best they've ever heard their system sound, you know you're on the right track. But even as you start moving up and mixing bigger bands, you're still going to run into shows where, you know, some or all of the production is in-house or it's being provided locally. And you'll have a system that's not quite right and a system tech who doesn't know how to fix it or doesn't even realize there's a problem. So it really doesn't matter what level of touring or mixing you're doing, you're going to run into situations like this more often than you'd like. So there are really only a handful of gigs where you have the luxury of speccing whatever gear you want and knowing that it will be there no matter where you go in the world. So if you're the engineer mixing an artist with a very generous production budget and who's willing to fly your entire rig with them, whether they're touring in the US or South America or Southeast Asia, consider yourself lucky. But for the rest of us, you know, we have to deal with things like budgets and truck space and front of house space and being able to find all of that gear anywhere in the world. So after having worked for a wide variety of artists over the years, and many of whom play a very wide variety of venues and countries, you know, I could be doing arenas in Japan and Southeast Asia, right into festivals in Europe and clubs and theaters in South America, and then, you know, any combination of that in the US. So my goal is to make sure that I can create a great sounding, consistent mix no matter where I am and with whatever gear I'm on. So this all has led to my approach to mixing, which is building my mix in the desk, not the box. The box being a Waves rack full of plugins or racks full of outboard gear and computers telling me how things sound. I don't use any plugins, and that surprises a lot of people. The benefit to this is that I'll never be standing in the middle of a field in Northern England at a festival on a Sunday, frantically trying to reach tech support because my licenses have stopped working. And I'll never be holding up the show because the desk won't recognize my Waves rack. I've seen this happen on more than one occasion, and it's really not a place anyone ever wants to be. So while I think you'll find a lot of my fellow veteran engineers on this summit love the technology, and I'm not saying that's bad, there's nothing wrong with that. My setup is just very organic, comparatively speaking. It's kind of a less is more kind of thing. But the one thing that we all share is an understanding of the basic fundamentals. And I'm fairly certain that every one of them could create an outstanding mix without anything more than what's on the desk. And that is the key. You know, the plugins and the outboard gear, they're just like the icing on a cake. And the cake is actually a good, solid, great sounding mix. But how do you build a great mix without all the fancy gear? That's what I'm going to talk about. It all starts with listening. You know, it's easy to forget how important listening is when you start relying on the technology to tell you how things sound. But what I've learned over the years is that mixing a great sounding show actually starts long before I get to the console or the gig. It all begins with knowing what the mix should sound like. And the first thing I do after getting hired for a tour is get the artist catalog. If there's a set list for the tour, I'll make a playlist with all of those songs and I'll start listening and dissecting the songs. This is critical listening. And when we talk about getting back to basics, this is really where it all starts. You need to know how to listen, how to hear what's going on in the mix. You're not just plugging in a bunch of microphones and turning them up. You need to understand the interplay between the instruments and the vocals. What effects are happening? What's the balance of the instruments? What are their tones like? Where is the placement of everything in the 3D space? If you don't know the music, I'm not saying that you can't mix a good sounding show, but it won't be a great mix if you're missing all the little nuances in the songs that the fans are expecting to hear. Like that tiny little chime in the beginning of the verses or the keyboard part in the chorus that complements what the guitar player is doing. All of that stuff is important. So the first step in improving your mixing skills is really learning how to listen. Even if you're not working with one particular band or artist, say you work for a sound company and one week you're mixing a folk festival, the next week a bluegrass band, the week after that a pop act, and on and on. Well, if you only listen to hard rock, how are you going to know how to mix folk or bluegrass? You do your homework before the gig. You listen to some folk or bluegrass music, break it down. What does a banjo really sound like? If you've never listened to a banjo, it's going to be hard to know what one should sound like. So while you're EQing the crap out of it, trying to make it sound good, if you were familiar with banjo music, oh, that's just how they sound. And you'd save yourself a lot of frustration. So if you want to create a great mix, you first need to be able to identify what sounds great. You need a starting point. You need to know what makes a kick drum sound good and how does a kick drum in a heavy metal band sound different from a kick drum in a jazz trio. If you want an amazing crushing guitar sound, you need to know what an amazing guitar sounds like. Otherwise, how are you going to know when you've got it? Well, critical listening is how you do this. And it's also what lets you hear the difference between equipment, from microphones to consoles. If you can't hear the difference between the sound of a Yamaha CL5 and a Midas Pro X, you need to work on your critical listening. It's how you find the sweet spot for mic placement, how you work with the keyboard player to tweak their sound so they're not competing with the other instruments and vocals. Or say if your guitar player is trying to decide which acoustic to play for a song and they want your opinion. It's how you hear which fits better in the arrangement and the mix. We can easily forget how important it is to do a lot of critical listening, especially when you get out there on a tour and you're mixing the same artist for months or years, or if you work for a sound company in a venue and you're just doing gig after gig after gig. I know for me, when I'm in the middle of a tour that's been out for months, I'll have to remind myself every so often to go back and really listen to the artist's music for a reference or a reality check. You get used to hearing what you're doing every night. And then when you go back and listen to the songs again, you'll start picking out things that you may have missed the first couple times around. So then when you add them to your mix, it kicks it up a notch. So if you've never really done any critical listening, I'm going to give you a simple exercise that you can do to get started. Start with 3 songs from a variety of artists. Listen to them one at a time, and then first identify all of the different instruments you can hear in each song. And then go back and listen to those songs again and give some details about the instruments. What are their tones like? What is the guitar tone like? What does the snare sound like? How would you describe the vocal? And then go back again and listen to where the instruments sit in the mix. What is the stereo imaging like? What is the 3-dimensional imaging? And then listen one more time for effects. What kind of effects are happening on the vocal? Can you tell if it's a plate or a hall reverb? Is there chorusing, delay, auto-tune? Are there any reverb or effects on the instruments? And now think about how you would recreate that mix live. When I'm learning the artist's music, I do a lot of critical listening and I dissect the songs. I'll break it down into as much detail as I can for all the different parts. Intro, it starts with acoustic, guitar, and vocal. Are they equal in level or is the vocal on top? First verse, what's the instrumentation? Acoustic, vocal, keys, bass, drums. What's the balance of the volume between all that? Are there any little nuances like a chime or a shaker, cowbell? What are the tones like? I'll go through the whole song like this, making tons of notes. I have like a notebook full of notes for every tour I do. This is my guide for recreating the mix live. So do a lot of listening and train your ears to really dissect what you're hearing. And also make it a point to listen to musical genres that you don't normally listen to, because you never know what you're going to be mixing next. And then when you get to the gig or rehearsal, go stand on the stage and listen to what the instruments sound like acoustically. Sit down behind the drum kit and listen to the drums. Hear them the way the drummer hears them. What does the guitar amp sound like to the guitar player? Hear what the instruments actually sound like before you put a mic on it and start dialing it into the console. Which brings me to another basic fundamental. Start with great sounds at the source. You know, back in the old days of analog consoles, before digital and before there were plugins, when I was just getting started mixing bands, you had to use whatever gear the venue had. And if the band that you were working for didn't have a budget, and most don't when they're just starting out, much of the time that meant using a lot of garbage for gear. Many of the consoles at this level, they only had a 3-band EQ on the channels. High and low were shelf filters, and you had a sweepable mid. But there really wasn't a lot you could do with EQ. You know, booster cut with the high shelf at around 12K and a low shelf around 80. If you were lucky, you might have had 2 sweepable mids and a high pass filter. And the high pass was usually fixed at 80 or 100. But there really wasn't a lot you could do with EQ on the console. So this forced you to work on getting great sounds from the instruments themselves. You know, it meant tuning the drum kit because you didn't have enough EQ on the channel to get rid of that horrible ring coming from the snare drum. Experimenting with mic choice and mic placement to get a great kick drum sound. Guitar tones, getting them dialed in at the amp and then moving the mic around to find the sweet spot on the amp. Finding the right vocal mic for the singer and teaching them how to use proper mic technique. Making sure the source sounds as good as it can before you mic it frequently gets overlooked. You know, all too often we're in such a hurry that as soon as the back line is up, we're miking and wiring and doing line check without even listening to what it sounds like on the stage. So then you start adding all kinds of plugins to try and fix what could have been done by simply tuning the drums or moving the mic on the guitar cabinet, because right now it's actually on a blown speaker and that's why it sounds terrible. Or trying a different mic on the singer. The drums might be ringing horribly, and we just throw on a gate and a pile of EQ when it would have been better to tune the drums. Again, back in the old days, most analog desks didn't come with onboard gates and compressors, and a lot of times the clubs didn't have enough for what you needed. And if they did, they were usually such low quality that you didn't want to use them. So that meant, again, getting your drums tuned, because if they're ringing and you only have 2 channels of gates, but you've got, 6 channels of drums, you're going to have to choose which one gets the gate. And it meant writing your bass guitar and your vocal, because the 2 compressors that they have sound so bad, you're better off without them. There was a compressor, a particular compressor. I won't mention the brand because they actually do make high quality gear, but with this, I don't know what happened. You'd insert it and it would just destroy the sound of whatever you put through it. You'd have a great sounding vocal and throw on this compressor and it'd just be like, oh my God, what happened? So you were better off without it. But the point is, and why I keep referring to the old days, is that having the lack of having any and every option available today, like 4-band, fully parametric EQ, gates and comps on every channel, dynamic EQ, all kinds of bells and whistles, it forced us to have to work to get better sounds with what we had available, because you couldn't just throw a bunch of plugins in the chain to fix it. And ultimately, that led to a better sounding mix. And the thing is, plugins and racks of outboard gear, they won't fix a bad mix. They can only improve a good mix. So get your source sounding as good as it can. And then choose the right mic. Now, this involves more than just the sound of the mic. When it comes to microphones, most of us have our preferences. However, our preferences might not work. I might love Sennheiser 421s on toms, but if the drummer's kit is so tight that I can't squeeze a 421 in there, I'm going to have to compromise with something smaller or just deal with the drummer hitting the mic all night. If you've got a singer who has terrible mic technique, you probably don't want to put them on a hypercardioid mic. Speaking of compromise, there is a certain level of compromise in many aspects of what we do. And when it comes to microphones, there may be a lot of compromise between what works for the band and what you want or need. When I was mixing Gwen Stefani's first solo tour, I was not a fan of her vocal mic. I just didn't think it worked very well for her voice. And we tried at least a half a dozen different mics on her during rehearsals. But when I settled on what I liked best, it just didn't work for her. She couldn't get what she needed from it in her ear monitors. The mic that she'd been using for years had some very specific tonal characteristics, and it was also considerably lighter than the microphone that I liked. But she'd grown used to hearing a specific sound in her head, and it was going to take some time for her to get comfortable with a new microphone. But since this was her first solo tour, she had so many other things that she had to worry about, like choreography and costume changes and running around the stage in 9-inch high platform shoes. The only thing that she was comfortable with was her singing and her monitors. And that comfort is more important than me not liking the microphone. Could I make it work? Yeah, it was just going to take a little bit more effort up front on my part, but ultimately I would be getting a much better performance from her. And in the end, that makes my job easier. I knew that if she wasn't comfortable with her mic, she wasn't going to be able to give me her best performance. And that would end up making my job harder, no matter how good the microphone sounded. So it just goes back to getting great sounds from the source. So when you're choosing microphones, there are other things to consider than just what you want to use. You need to keep the big picture in mind. What is going to help your artists give you their best performance? What can you do to inspire confidence and make them more comfortable? Because the better they play or sing, the easier it is to get a good mix. All right, gain structure. I know there was a couple of questions sent in about gain structure, and this could be a touchy subject because everybody has their preferred way of setting gain, whether it's starting with the faders down or faders at 0. Just as long as you're not doing your mixing on your gain knobs. I saw that in a forum somewhere, and an expert was telling everybody that you keep all your faders at 0 and mix the show with the gain pots. Just don't do that. But start with setting optimal gain on your inputs. Everything follows your gain structure. If you don't have good signal level at the head amp or preamp, you're just going to be chasing your tail trying to make up for it elsewhere. Gain structure and signal flow are two of the most important principles in live sound. Understanding signal flow, especially through the console, is the key to being able to mix on any desk. You could be an expert on the Yamaha CL5. You know every knob and button on it and what everything does. But if you don't understand signal flow through the desk, what are you going to do when you've got a Midas or an Abbott in front of you? I mean, sure, operating systems are all different, but signal flow is the same. Essentially, gain, polarity, high pass, EQ, dynamics, pre or post EQ, aux and group buses, pan, fader, master bus, etc. But when you understand signal flow through the desk, it's just a matter of familiarizing yourself with the surface and getting a grip on where everything is. But back to gain structure. The idea is to get a strong signal level coming into the desk. You want to be hitting solid green on the input meter, just below the yellow. If the volume of the input is too loud when you have the fader at 0 and you're hitting the last green on the input meter, you can either back off the gain a little bit to get the volume to where you want, or you can bring your fader back a bit, but you really want to stay in the sweet spot with the fader, which is about between plus or minus 5 dB. I am a little unorthodox with my input gain, and it just comes from mixing on analog for so many years. I hit my input gain pretty hard on most inputs. I'm into solid yellow on the Midas, but I can't do that with other consoles. And that's something that I like about the Midas Pro series is you can drive it like an XL4. You could run an XL4 until it was almost in the red. And the harder you hit it, the better it sounded. With the Pro X or any of the Pro series, staying in the yellow is not going to hurt you. You can't do this on other consoles. I don't know about all of them, but there's definitely a few that it's a problem. I did a fly date once. It was a one-off where I had to mix on a CL5 after months of mixing on the Midas. And I was used to driving the desk the way I do, but when I was doing line check and bringing the mix up in the PA, it was just all distorted. It sounded terrible. And I looked at the masters and they were just lighting up yellow. So as soon as I dialed it back, the mix was fine. But then I had to go and adjust all of my gain on my inputs and everything. But as soon as this console hits yellow, it would just fall apart. It's awful. So there's another desk too that sounds great if you're mixing a couple of inputs or a nice acoustic show. But once you throw a hard hitting rock band on it and you go above green on your output meters, it's kind of like somebody puts a box over the mix. They're good consoles. They're great consoles and they're very popular, but they just don't work for me and the way that I like to mix. So back to the Midas, I drive it pretty hard because I can, and it actually sounds better this way. I've tried many times to redo my input gain because I know what proper gain structure is. I teach proper input, proper gain, and I know that summing all of those inputs together is hitting the master bus really hard, but this just works for me. If my drums are not hitting solid yellow, I don't get the sound that I want. I just can't do it. I've tried many times. So I drive my inputs hard and they sound the way I want them to. There is really a noticeable difference in the way the Midas sounds when you go from green to solid yellow. But again, this doesn't work well on many other digital consoles. So if you're going to try it, just be very careful. When you learn how to listen and you know the music and you've got good players and great sounds at the source and good gain structure, you should really just be able to bring up the faders and have the bones of a great mix. That's your foundation. And once you have a solid foundation, you start building on it using what you have available on the desk. Start with the high pass filter. I use the high pass filter very liberally to clean up boominess and open up space in the low frequency range. The high pass filter often gets overlooked, and it is one of the easiest ways to add tons of clarity to your mix. I'll use the low pass filter as well when I have it to free up space in the high frequencies. When mixing a live band with amps on stage, for me, I want as clean as a signal as possible. So the high pass and low pass filters get rid of a lot of the extraneous noise that's coming down the lines. My snare drum doesn't really need anything below 100 hertz, and my hi-hat and overheads don't need anything below 250. My kick drum doesn't really need anything above 15K, and nor does my bass mic. Especially with vocals, I just want what I need specific to that input. But this frees up space in those frequency ranges for the instruments that actually need to be there. You clean up your subs for the bass and the kick drum and maybe some really deep synth patches. Clean up the high highs for clarity on your cymbals, things like that. So when you're mixing a band with a 0 stage volume or something like a quiet acoustic act, you can probably get away with less use of the high pass, but you still have the PA noise and the venue acoustics that are being picked up by the microphones. So using the high pass is a real easy way to clean up your sounds. And this brings me to EQ. EQ is one of the best tools for really shaping your mix. It can create the sounds we want. It can get rid of problem frequencies and feedback. It can polish your mix and create balance and space in the mix. It can even create depth and be used as an effect. I use a good amount of EQ. I use gain and EQ to get the punch for my drums. I'll EQ the drums and boost the highs and around the high mids to get the sound that I want. And when I have the gain hitting solid yellow with a very dynamic drummer, when he's playing quieter, I'll still have good signal level and drums that are clear and present. And then when he starts really laying into it, that boost in the highs gives me the extra punch that I need. I also use EQ to create space and separation between the instruments, just like little pockets for everything to sit in. If you've got several instruments all competing for the same frequency space, let's say an organ, a guitar, and a vocal, You can use EQ to carve out space for all of them. Usually your lead vocal is the priority in the mix. So start with cleaning up the low mids to get rid of any muddiness and reveal clarity. And then find the prominent frequency in the singer's voice. For example, if the singer is really strong in the mid range, you can notch out a little bit of that frequency in the guitar and organ to open up space for the vocal to pop through. And then you want to create some space between the guitar and organ. So you might add some high mids to the organ and some presence on the guitar. But since you took out some low mids on the vocal, that leaves a bit of a hole for some of the fullness on the guitar. This allows for separation, so everything is not crowding each other. Now, of course, you could do this with sidechain compression, but I prefer to do it with EQ rather than adding sidechain compression everywhere. It's less things in the signal path when you do it with EQ. If you just need to throw a sidechain on the snare for the vocal or the kick and the bass, that's one thing. But when you've got a lot of stuff in the mix that's competing with each other and you start putting sidechain compression on half of your inputs, the next thing you know is you've got a ton of compression all over your mix. And speaking of compression is all the rage right now. Parallel compression, bus compression, 3 levels deep of compression. If you're having problems with your mix and it sucks and you don't know why, just check to see that you're not overusing compression. Just because it's there doesn't mean you need to use it. Compression is used to control the dynamic range of a signal, make the loudest and the difference between the loudest and quietest parts smaller. It's a fantastic tool. It can tame the wild dynamics of a singer who goes from a whisper to a scream. Someone had asked about, how to handle a drummer who's very inconsistent. It's a perfect place for compression. It's perfect for musicians who fluctuate in how they play, or if you have a keyboard player whose patches are all over the map in level, it can keep those levels under control. It prevents your signals and your system from clipping. But all too often, people are using compression just for loudness or because they think they need to, because everybody's doing it. And in the end, what you end up with is a mix that sounds flat and lifeless because you've squashed the dynamic range. If you want your drums to sound more punchy, try making that happen with gain and EQ instead, like I just showed you, and let your mix breathe. If you need 3 layers deep of compression on your singer, something's wrong. There's either a problem with your gain structure or your signal path or something else, or you're just not setting the compressor correctly. There's nothing wrong with using compression, but it shouldn't be the foundation of your mix. As far as what I do with compression, I'll use some compression on the kick and snare if the drummer is very dynamic. And I set it so it's just catching the loudest signals. And I send all of my drums to a stereo group with very light compression just to pull the kit together. Once I have my drum mix happening, I don't want, if he happens to get crazy for a minute, I don't want a tom popping out louder than everything else. So I just use some light compression on a drum group. I don't send them to another group for parallel compression or to add punch. I get the attack and the punch from my gain and EQ. I also don't use parallel compression on guitars. If I use any compression on guitars, it's only because the guitar player has some significant level changes, maybe from switching instruments on the same line or, different settings on their pedals. And actually, if I want to create impact with my guitars, I'll send them to a stereo delay, about 20 milliseconds on one side, 40 milliseconds on the other, pan it hard and no feedback. And then I'll ride the delay returns in, to the mix at whatever level I want to get the imaging that I want. And sometimes I'll EQ the delayed channels a bit to add more edge or more bottom, whatever I'm going for. For keyboards and tracks, if the levels are all over the place, I'll add compression to keep things in line. But I do what I can to get the levels consistent from the source first. With Elvis Costello, we have a huge keyboard world. I think there's something like 18, 20 inputs of keyboards. And several of those inputs will have a wide variety of patches coming down them, at any given time. Normally, I'll work with the keyboard player during rehearsals or sound check to make sure what he or she is sending me is consistent. But in this case, Steve is very creative and impulsive. So I never have any idea what he's going to send me. He never plays a song the same way twice. He doesn't even play the same sounds or patches on the same songs. One day, this song might have an old vintage synth sound, and the next day it's a saxophone. Seriously. And there will be 6 to 10 dB difference in level. So this is a perfect situation for compression. If I've got everything dialed in for the synth patch and he suddenly sends me a horn patch that's 5 dB hotter, I don't want that to come screaming through the mix. So I use compression to keep things in check. And while I'm on the subject, I'm going to back up a little bit to getting great sounds from the source. Don't forget about keyboards and playback tracks. I'll try and work with the keyboard player or their tech during rehearsals to make sure that the levels and tones are balanced. Sometimes what they're hearing and needing on stage doesn't really work so well with what I need in the house. For example, depending on the stage volume and if they're using wedges or IEMs, the keyboard player might be cranking the heck out of the high end so they can hear their keys through everything else. But those highs could be killing me in the house. So we'll work together to get what I need and then let the monitor engineer make the adjustments for the stage in the monitor mix. Playback tracks and stems are another thing that often needs some tweaking at the source. Depending on the act that you're mixing, the likelihood of your show containing at least a handful of playback tracks is very high. With the current trend of pop music and other genres employing a multitude of producers or beat makers on every song, it's very common to have tracks and stems coming from more than one source or producer. And what this means is there is very little consistency of instrumentation and levels, especially from song to song. I've done several tours that had live band and tracks, and the tracks and stems came from a whole slew of producers. They came in all different combinations. Some songs were broken down to all of the individual instruments on their own stems. Some had things grouped together like stereo drum mix. Others had things like guitar, horn, synth, and bass all grouped together in a mix. So we really had to put a lot of work into getting things grouped and balanced in a way that made sense for mixing. So I always try and sit down with the musical director or the programmer during rehearsals to sort this out. We'll work to balance the levels between all of the tracks so that what's coming to me and the monitor engineer is as consistent as possible. We would just want to set it and forget it when it comes to the tracks. There's usually so many other cues going on and things that we need to really pay attention to during the show. We don't want to be sitting there mixing track levels all night. And if time allows, I will have the MD listen to the tracks in the PA alone without the band. Because another thing I've found is, at least with pop music, much of the time when tracks are being prepared in a studio, there is a tendency to overcompensate with the bass. The level on the bass tracks is boosted so much that when it's played over the PA system, the bass is overwhelming and it's driving the system into compression. So depending on the MD, they might also be pushing the bass tracks on stage so they can feel it the way they want to on stage and not understanding what's happening in the house. So when I can get them to front of house to listen to what's happening, they can hear how it's just burying everything else, and then they get it. But again, this is all part of getting great sounds from the source. So getting back to compression. I use it for control to keep things in check. And as far as compression on the master bus, I use minimal. I use the Waves Max BCL for this. You can see it in the rack. And I set it so it's just barely tickling the threshold and only 2-to-1 or at most 3-to-1 ratio. I like dynamics. I want the mix to breathe. What I love about the Waves, actually, there's a couple things, but number one, the compressor is as transparent as you want it to be. The bass enhancement feature comes in very handy on local production shows where the subs are inadequate or you just can't fit enough subs in the space. You can select the crossover frequency, and what it does is generates harmonics on the frequency below that point. And it works kind of like on psychoacoustic principles. So it ends up not really taxing your speakers, but giving you the sense of more low end. And the limiter is my favorite part. It only acts on the peaks of the signal. It doesn't squash your full mix. So when something like the snare goes above the threshold, it'll stop the snare, but let the rest of the signal come up to meet it. So you don't end up with a really heavily compressed or limited sound. You can retain the dynamics. And again, I use just very light compression and limiting with that. I know a lot of my peers on here love parallel compression, compression groups, and bus compression, and adding compression for color. But the thing is, they know how to build a great mix first, and then they add compression on top, like the icing on a cake. But if you don't fully understand what you're doing with compression, you can end up sucking the life right out of your mix. I've seen guys have 3 levels deep of compression on their lead vocal and then wonder why they can't get it on top of the band. Compression is a great tool, just don't make it the foundation of your mix. So imagine that you don't have any compression or gates available, and it will force you to sort out any issues with the instruments themselves before you start building your show. And if you really want to test your mixing skills, mix with no effects. Learn how to create depth with EQ. Learn how to let things breathe, how to let the mix breathe. It's kind of like the insecure singer who wants a lot of reverb on their vocal to cover up the weak spots. We can hide a lot of stuff with reverb and effects. But mixing without effects will help you learn how to use EQ to place things in your mix. And it also helps you find any problems because there is no reverb to hide them. If you can make your show sound great without effects, it will sound that much better when you add them later. Another basic part of building a great mix is your workflow on the desk. And while this is more functional than technical, it's still a very important part of mixing. Because of the limited number of channels on the surface with digital, you really need to think about your workflow. If you're mixing a simple, straightforward 4-piece band or something with just a handful of inputs, it's not as big of an issue. But when you start getting into more involved shows with lots of cues and large numbers of inputs, it does require some pre-planning. Think about control and efficiency. How can you set up your desk so that you can get to whatever you need as quickly and efficiently as possible? This can affect everything from your input patch to your automation. If you've got 48 channels on a desk that has only 8 channels on the surface, and you've got instrument changes and several singers who trade off and guitar solos and all kinds of cues, you're going to need to put some thought into how you're going to get to all of that quickly when you need to. Even more so if you're mixing monitors. So a lot of the artists that I mix have a significant number of inputs and very involved shows, basically everything changing every song, and a mixture of track and live band. So I probably put as much thought into my workflow as I do into what gear I'm going to use for the tour. I'll show you my workflow from the most recent tour with Elvis as an example. So yes, as you've heard, I mix on the Midas Pro X. And for anyone who is not familiar with Midas consoles, they're a bit limited in how they populate the surface. It's not a console that you can just build as you like and put anything anywhere you want. It's also different than most in that it doesn't work in layers and pages. The surface is laid out linearly and numerically. And basically, you use your VCAs and pop groups to bring whatever you want to the surface. So if I hit my drum VCA, it brings everything assigned to that VCA to the input channels on the surface. And they'll appear in order from lowest number channel to the highest number channel. And that happens over here in your input section. With the Midas, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that some other desks do, but for me, it has the sound that I want. I'm not a big fan of digital, and for anyone who knows me, I went kicking and screaming into the digital age. But in my opinion, the Midas sounds better than most other digital consoles. For me, it's about using the right tool for the job. And I choose better audio quality over features. I don't want to have to spend thousands of dollars on plugins to make my desk sound better. I'd rather just use a console that sounds good, at least for most of what I mix. For another show, I might need all of those bells and whistles, and the audio quality might not be as big of an issue. If you're mixing a boy band and the audience is 20,000 screaming little girls, none of them really care about your drum sound, So back to workflow. Normally, I do the majority of my mixing on VCAs. So I group everything in a way that I have control of each band member with one VCA. And on this show, because I really have to keep a handle on the keyboard channels, I leave them on the surface on the inputs for the majority of the show. My breakdown of VCAs is one for drums, one for bass, one for guitars. The Steve VCA is all of my keyboard inputs. I have a kick VCA, which is my kick in mic. And that's just so I can adjust the tone of the drum as needed from the master section. On some of the quieter songs, I'll want just the outside mic for a softer or rounder sound. But then on the more rocking songs, I'll want some more of the attack from the inside mic. So I have it on a VCA so I can get to it and not have to pull it up on the input section because I've got my keyboard channels there. I've got a VCA for Ableton for a few songs that have some sounds triggered from that. A band VCA for everything but vocals. Effects VCA has all of my band and background vocal effects. I have Elvis's vocal effects on the B section all the way over to the far right side of the console. And that's just because I don't have enough VCAs to separate them out. So I can just keep them there and mute and unmute as needed. VCA for background vocals and one for Elvis. And for groups, I'm sending all of my keys to a stereo group. I've got a stereo drum group and a stereo background vocal group. The keys and drums have light compression, again, just to keep anything from jumping out. And I do a bit of EQ on the vocal group, as well as their individual channels, just for the overall blend of the background vocals. I should also mention that this show it's a kind of a fly by the seat of your pants mixing. Elvis has a catalog of about 500 songs, and he covers every genre from pop to punk, alternative, country, gospel, Broadway. The set list is basically a suggestion. He gets to the third song on the list, and then it just goes out the window. And it's as far from a set it and forget it mix as you could possibly get. Add to that, I've got a keyboard player who, as I mentioned earlier, is very impulsive and creative. And Elvis has a variety of electric and acoustic guitars that he may at any moment decide to play. He could be in the middle of a song on electric and then suddenly decide to switch to acoustic. And there's no warning. He's also got 3 guitar amps and a bunch of pedals that he switches between whenever he feels like it. So my show is basically chasing him and the keyboard player around all night because I never know what I'm going to get. And it requires your full attention. Luckily, the rhythm section and background vocals are really tight. So once they're dialed in, I don't need to worry about them. But for the most part, I really need to keep my eye on the inputs, the key inputs, so I can see what's coming at me from where. Normally, I will program snapshots or scenes for each song, but it's impossible to do that for this show because there is no consistency and I never know what is coming next. So I mix in a very analog fashion, which is fine because I love that. I set up my VCAs in groups so that I can get to anything quickly and easily. I use the pop groups for quick navigation as well. For instance, Elvis does a few songs at the piano during the show. So I have all of the inputs that I need for those songs on the Elvis piano pop group. And I've got all my vocals, Elvis and background vocals on a pop group in case I need to blend, adjust the blend for those, and so on. So every input on my desk is somewhere in this section so I can get to it quickly. I also use the mute groups a bit creatively. I was never a fan of the all mute group. I mute my inputs via the VCAs, which can tend to freak out the occasional system tech when I'm doing one-offs with local production. I've had times where I'll finish sound check and mute everything via my VCAs, only to come back to the console for showtime, and there's nothing coming out of the PA when the show starts because the system tech assigned everything to an all mute because they thought I left all my channels open. But they didn't tell me. So if you're ever teching for someone, do not change anything on their console, especially any kind of programming. And if for any reason you need to, make sure to tell them before the show starts. One thing I do wish this console had was macro buttons that the Digico has. I've got a couple songs with some specific effects cues. One song has a spring reverb with a bit of a slapback delay on the side stick. And the regular snare mic has a short plate reverb. I need to switch back and forth between the two of them pretty quickly during the verses. And I also mute the snare bottom mic when he's playing side stick. So I have 4 mute groups set up that I can just bounce back and forth between those for that particular song. I can't bring the channels to the surface because I'm also dealing with my random keyboard patches. So this would be a great place for a couple macro keys, but my workaround is the mute groups. And I build my mix around the lead vocal. I will use EQ to create a pocket for it to sit in so I don't need to do any side chaining. The band sounds are really great and they complement each other rather than compete with each other. The drums sit nicely with the bass. Elvis's guitar is in its own little spot and the background vocals virtually mix themselves. The keys are my only wild card, and I'll take a little notch out on the EQ of the keyboard group for Elvis's vocal to sit in. But honestly, his vocal just really fits in nicely with the instruments. As far as effects go, I have a few songs that have specific effects cues for just that song. But since I can't rely on automation for this show, and because I have the space, I've got my effects racks built so that I need to do as few parameter changes as possible. What I'm using is, starting from the top left, TCM 350 for my drum verb. The Vintage Room is for one song where I need a very long reverb for Elvis for one short cue. I have a TCM 2000 in my front of house rack that I use for his main effects because I like the sound of that better than the onboard effects. The first delay is for one song as well, and it's a specific cue in the middle of the song. Then another Vintage Room for the background vocals. I've got a stereo delay that I use on background vocals just to move them around. It's got 10 milliseconds on the left and 20 on the right, no feedback, and it's panned like 6 and 3. I'm not 6 and 3, 9 and 3. And I bring that in and out depending on the song to create some depth and some interest with the background vocals. The chamber reverb is for the piano. And then another stereo delay that I use as a vocal doubler for Elvis. I don't really use it all that much, just subtly in some songs. Then distortion, which again is one specific cue in one song. The second rack has dynamic EQ for Elvis, the other drum reverb for my side stick cue, dynamic EQ for the spare vocal, Vintage Room for guitars, dynamic EQ for Elvis piano vocal, and a tap delay for Elvis. And that's about it. My one front of house rack consists of the Waves Max BCL, and that's inserted on the master bus. TCM 2000 for Elvis's vocal effects, CD player, Lake Contour for my system EQ, KT Network Bridge for multi-track recording, and the DL 451. That was just used for extra inputs at front of house. That's it. No Waves rack, no plugins. And if I had to, I could do my show without any of the stuff in this rack. As far as what I do for system tuning, my system tech will get the system up and time aligned with Smart or whatever they like to use, and then hand it over to me to EQ. And I do the system EQ with the Lake and using my ears in various songs. I don't use Smart or any other kind of analyzation tools. No RTA, just my ears. Not to bring up the old days again, but this came from when I was mixing bands and clubs, and we didn't have the money for an RTA, and Smart and other tools like it didn't exist yet. So I had to learn how to tune the system with my ears. What I do is I use a variety of songs. And the first song that I play is an instrumental, and it's great for highlighting any problem areas. I walk around the room and listen to what the PA sounds like in the room, what the room is doing and what the PA is doing. This is kind of like my acclimation period to the room of the day and sometimes the PA of the day. Next, I have a track that I use to clean up all the low, muddy stuff. And then something that's got some nice highs in it to do the work I need in the highs. And then I use Hella Good from No Doubt for the harsh upper mid-range and the subs. If there's time, I'll throw on another track. But that's pretty much it. It might vary a bit depending on the bands I'm working with, but that's the gist of it. And when I'm EQing, I'll start with just the main hang. I'm acclimating, I'll have everything on, but when I start EQing, I'll listen to just the main left and right. I'll have the subs and front fill muted as well as any other sides or delays. And when I'm happy with the main hang, I'll add in the subs, do whatever tweaking I need to do. And then I listen to the front fill alone and do my EQ for that, and then add in the subs and the mains. When doing arenas or sheds with side hangs, like in this photo, I'll EQ the side hangs to fill in what's missing rather than as another main PA. There's always some blow over from the main hang and the side hang, which can create buildup of frequency ranges, usually in the mid range. So my approach is to make the side and main hang sound like one unit as opposed to walking in and out of different PAs. And I'll also make sure to listen to just the side hangs when I'm at the mix position so that I can hear how much, if any of it, is hitting me and what frequency range it is. When I'm mixing during the show, it might be a little heavy in 630 and I'm trying to take it out of the mains and it's not changing because it's actually blowing across from the sides. And then I just listen to the whole rig and make any final adjustments. And once I'm happy, depending on the act, I will ring out the lead vocal mic in the PA if it's a show where the singer will be out in front of the PA. Like in Gwen's show, she ran around the entire arena for a song. Also, Big Time Rush, it had 4 singers who did an entire song in the middle of the audience. I don't have that problem with Elvis, but that's how I tune my PA. The thing about SMART and other various system optimization programs is they're fantastic tools if you know how to use them correctly. If you don't, they can do more damage than good. And they're tools. So don't let them take the place of your skills. It will really benefit you to learn how to EQ a system with your ears because there will be times when you have to. Ideally, we'd love to have an hour for noising and tuning the system, but the reality is there's barely enough time. Even doing arena and shed tours, I usually spend 15 to 20 minutes tops EQing. There's just too much other stuff going on, and the time you have for noising and tuning the system is very limited. There's a lot of other departments working around each other. Lighting and video need to be hung, set and backline are being built, and all of this requires people being able to hear each other and not have to scream over the PA. It's a safety thing. A lot of stuff needs to happen in a very short amount of time, so you just need to be conscious of that. And spending an hour tuning is usually not possible. If you work in a venue where you've got an in-house rig and plenty of time to do this, that's great. But on tour, when you're doing one-offs and all kinds of gigs in different places, it just usually doesn't happen. So these tools are great, but what do you do when you're on a fly date into a festival in the middle of Prague and you're doing a throw and go? You're using all local production. You've got no sound check time and just barely enough time to get your band mic'd and wired and do a quick line check over the PA. So you've got to mix your show on the fly and there's no time for setting up SMART. You need to be able to understand what you're hearing without using a computer. And let's add to that, your desk isn't talking to your Waves rack. So now you can't use any of your plugins. Or better yet, it's a desk that you've never mixed on before because the desk that they told you would be there fell off the forklift and it's no longer working. And you don't even have a file to start with. So now you're starting from scratch. This shit happens, trust me. So it's back to basics. What do? First, remain calm. Get as much of your band gear pre-mic'd and wired as you can so that when you get the stage for changeover, you'll have more time for doing a proper line check. This is also great if you're mixing a support act. Get as much of your stuff pre-staged before you hit the stage so that you just have to plug in a couple cables and then you can get on with your sound check or line check. If you have time, get out in the house and take a good listen to the PA while the other bands are on so that you have an idea of what you're dealing with. Is it super harsh? Is there some crazy low end rolling around? Well, just make a mental note because it may be different when you're mixing, but at least you'll have a heads up of what you'll want to adjust in the system EQ if it's the PA and not the other band's engineers. Find out when you can get onto the desk to start building your file. There might be some time before your band gets to the stage that you could take advantage of. Label your inputs, assign your groups, your VCAs, your effects. Set your high pass filters, rough in any EQ on your inputs that you can, and preset any gates and comps that you know you need. And then when you can line check, you want to first concentrate on getting optimal gain on all of your inputs. Set all the faders at 0 and you'll have a good starting point. Make sure that you get a thorough line check of all of your inputs before your band hits the stage. The last thing that you want is the show to start and to find out that you don't have a lead vocal because it's mispatched. So when you can't sound check, do as much at line check as you can, but your priority is to make sure that everything is working and coming up where it should be on your input channels. You can dial in EQ and gates and comps and effects during the show, but you don't want to spend half your show chasing down inputs that aren't where they're supposed to be. And then just mix your butt off, focus on getting the vocals dialed in. That will be the first complaint from the audience. They won't care if you don't have your delay time or your effects happening, or even if your comps and gates aren't quite right, but they will be screaming at you when they can't hear the vocal. So get your mix happening and then worry about dialing in dynamics and effects. This is a perfect example of how being able to build a mix on any desk without any plugins or outboard gear or system analyzation software will benefit you. And just so you're clear, I'm not saying that you shouldn't use any of these tools. They're great tools. But what I'm saying is be very careful of letting your skills decline because you rely too heavily on the tools and not your ears. Here's an analogy for you. You've got a so-so guitar rig and a not so great guitar player, and it's an uphill battle to make it sound good. The guitar player keeps adding all kinds of pedals to improve his sound, and you're EQing and trying every trick in the book to get it sounding good, but nothing helps. It just sounds terrible. But if you put the late Eddie Van Halen or Brian May on the same rig, it just sings like a bird. They could plug straight into the amp without all of the pedals, and all you need to do is bring it up in the PA and it sounds amazing. The difference is the skill, not the tools. So when you can mix a great show with nothing more than your ears and what's on the desk, you'll be a much more valuable engineer and also a better one. If you want to improve your mixing skills, learn how to listen. Use critical listening to train your ears. Understand the basic fundamentals like signal flow and gain structure. Know how to troubleshoot. Start with good sounds at the source. Choose the right mic and find the sweet spot with mic placement. Think about what you can do to get the best performance from your band or artist. Understand signal flow through the desk so that you can mix on whatever console you've got. Be able to build a great sounding mix with only what's on the desk. Use good gain structure and use EQ to shape your mix and create space as well as fine-tune your sounds. Don't overdo it with compression. Build a solid mix before adding things like creative compression and effects. If you do use plugins, make sure you have a saved file of your show without plugins as an emergency backup for when your licenses stop working or your desk won't see your waves rack or you're using a desk that doesn't have enough DSP. This will happen and that will save your life. Maybe not your life, but your show. Think about your workflow on the desk and set it up for ease of control and efficiency. When you don't have to be flipping through pages and layers or plugins all night, it really lets you concentrate on mixing. Learn how to use your ears to EQ and mix on the PA. And ideally, you want to be able to walk into any gig anywhere in the world and pull together a good mix with whatever they've got. So I challenge you to put away the plugins, the presets, the computers and analyzers, and only use what's available on the desk to build a good mix. And when you can do that, you'll be way ahead of everyone else. And for any of you who are kind of stressed out because you're just getting started and you don't have the money to spend on all the plugins and software and all this extra gear, I hope you've realized by now that you don't need any of that. And actually, if you don't use it, your mixing skills will improve. The technology is here to improve our job, not to do the job for us. If you wanted to just sit there and press next scene all night long, well, maybe you should have gone into lighting. I'm just kidding. But where's the fun in that? It's all about the art and the craft. And that is what I've got for you guys. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Oh my God, that was amazing. So
it was a lot, I know. Sorry.
No, it was so good. We didn't want to interrupt. You're getting lots of hand clap emojis. I'm just the emoji reporter now. Thank you so much. Yeah, that was so good. And what a great contrast with everything else that we've had. We kind of really ramped up in complexity through this entire event, right, guys? And then the last one, even I had to come on to talk about complexity. So really cool to kind of have a shift in focus here for a little bit. So we'll put the link to the questions box thing again in the chat. But otherwise, please raise your hand and ask Michelle questions and questions about Elvis, questions about touring, questions about the basics and how she has all this stuff set up. And while you guys are doing that, I will say something quickly, which is that when you were talking about Steve in the keyboards, I was like terrified because I have spent so much time in the past doing programming, working with the keyboards, working with the keyboard programmer to like find out what are you going to do next? What are you going to do next? Going through the recordings, like getting everything lined up. So for you to not know what sound is coming next, I'm like,
Oh yeah.
how does that work?
Yeah, it's crazy. That's like I literally just have to sit there with them on the Surface so I can see, because even he'll play the same patch but on different keyboards, different nights. So
Just to,
while he'll
just to
have
test you.
and no, it's just because he's just kind of like, oh, what do I want to do? So he might have this great organ sound that is coming down the Korg tonight, and then tomorrow it's going to come down a different line. So it's really just yeah, it's very
Yeah,
intense.
it's like this black box. Anything could come out. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see what you do with it. Okay. So I'm supposed to check the list. Okay, Debbie. Debbie, do you want to talk?
Sure. Thanks, Michelle, for your presentation today. It's been great hearing to you. I love this old school style. It's awesome. It's great. I want to talk to you about EQ for inputs, and it looks like you were doing more subtractive than additive EQ. And I wanted to talk about what you prefer, and then also how you put that in context of your overall system tuning. I know you were talking about using the Lake EQ, but how individual channel EQ affect overall system tuning.
Yeah, so I definitely do. With EQ, I always start by using subtractive EQ first. I'll try and clean up any problems before I need to add anything, because usually when you get rid of the problems, like if something's really muddy, if you get rid of that, you don't need to add any high end for clarity, and that helps prevent feedback. And also because EQ is another gain stage. So if you do a lot of boosting, it can actually end up clipping your signal. So I'll do both. And the drums, you can see, like I do some boosts in the high and high mids to get the sound that I want. But for most of my other inputs, it's a lot more subtractive than additive. But I do a lot of the EQing in the desk. So that what I'm hearing, like the mix output is the same pretty much every day. And the Lake I use to just kind of really get rid of any weirdness of the day with the room. And if it's a different PA every day, just to kind of make it sound the way I want it to sound, more to tailor the PA to what I like to hear. There's also like usually once I get into the tour, they'll be like, oh, okay, the vocal, I'm always taking this out every day. So I'll just take that out on the PA instead of on the channel. Things like that, but that's how I do it.
Thanks, Debbie. Tim, do you want to talk?
Yeah, sure.
Hey, Tim.
First of all, yeah, great presentation. You really got me energized. Just want to give me a band, give me a disc, and let's go. This is what I like. So I have two questions for you. The first one is how would you rate the importance of having a fixed set of test tracks?
For EQing the PA, like
yeah.
I mean, the biggest thing is to have songs that you are familiar with, that you listen to a lot, so that you know what they should sound like. It's so that no matter if you put it in your car, your home stereo, you're used to the way it sounds, so that when you put it in a PA, you have your reference of what it should sound like. So it's important to have stuff that you're familiar with. I mean, I have a Thomas Dolby song that I've been using since the 80s. A lot of the songs I use over and over and over. There'll be like little minor changes depending on the style of music I'm mixing, but it's kind of, my playlist will be the same for years. So
okay, clear. So second question was, do you use virtual sound check? And if so, then like when, like doing pre-prod, doing touring itself, or?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
So do you use virtual sound check?
Do I use virtual sound check? I do, mostly in the beginning of a tour, just when I'm still dialing things in. Not so much during once we get rolling, but I usually use it for like the first week or two, because I'm still dialing things in, and until my bands always like to sound check for some reason. So I don't really need to, but if I do a tour where the band isn't sound checking, I'll rely on it more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's go to Alish, and then I'll ask Ken Newman's question, and then we'll see what's next.
Hi, Michelle. Thanks for a
Ash.
great presentation. A quick question that doesn't have to really do with the technical side of things, but I'm interested to hear your opinion on this. I too am sometimes confronted with acts that don't use a set list, and I'm always struggling with trying to figure out which song is which by the titles that they sort of shout out into the audience. Do you have like a mnemonic device that you use or a particular workflow that helps you figure out what is coming your way, or is it just I'm waiting for the first 3 or 4 bars of the song to figure out if I need to switch my scene?
Yeah, like sometimes I'll make a little note, like with Elvis, it was just a ridiculous amount of songs to learn. Cause even, he had 500, but then he gave a list of about 150 for the band to learn for the tour. So, it's just like a lot of them I knew, but some of them I didn't. So I'd have to kind of put little notes, like I'd figure out certain things he was going to do before a certain song. So I could mentally know like, oh, when he does this, it's going to be this song. Or, the very first couple notes, like I'd make notes on my set list of what the first couple notes of that song would be, so that when I heard it. But yeah, sometimes it just takes like a couple bars in before you know what's coming. But he even does it to the band. I mean, there's been nights where he's they're vamping out the end of the song, and he'll turn around and say, "Everybody go to B." Like, they'll just throw out a key. They have no idea what song is coming. And then they have to wait till he gets halfway through the first verse to catch up with him. Like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Okay, cool. Ken Newman wants to know what microphone you were using on the vocals for Gwen Stefani.
It was an Audio Technica. I think it was the 5035, 5045. Can't remember totally because it was a long time ago, but it was Audio Technica RF mic, and it was I believe 5035. Yeah.
Cool. Mike, do you want to talk? Mike Reeves. I forgot to check if you have a mic. Potentially not. Okay. Being a drummer, this is the first time I've heard anybody muting the bottom snare during side stick. My guess would be that your bottom snare is out of phase and would be detrimental in the output of the crack of the side snare. And then he says, not available to talk. Thanks, Nathan. So got it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a phase thing. And I also, when I have drummers, like I'm Mr. Big, our drummer, he also sang. So whenever he was singing, I would mute the bottom snare mic, because between the vocal mic and the snare top and bottom all, intertwined, it would create some phasing issues. So whenever the drummer sings, I also mute the bottom snare.
Cool. I'm finding out that Evidence wants to ask a question. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I have these issues every time I try to ring out my PA. Right. I've done a lot of EQing. I've added a lot, but once in a while, this feedback just keep popping up. And you were talking about using your EQ to fight feedbacks and all. What tips do you have when it comes to fighting feedbacks and using EQ?
It's always a great idea to bring your lead vocal mic to front of house to use to ring out feedback. So once I get the system tuned and EQ'd the way I want, I'll bring the lead vocal if it's a wireless mic to front of house, or I'll have it on the stand at the front center position and have my monitor engineer or one of the techs talk into it. And even before that, like I'll just bring up the gain and the volume on the lead vocal till it starts to feedback, and then I'll notch those frequencies on the EQ. But if you find that you're starting to get a lot of feedback from one particular mic and it's causing you to take a lot out of your system EQ, you're better off doing that on that particular channel, so you don't end up making the PA sound unnatural from all those cuts. But another way you could do it too is just, you have the mic on the stand at the front center position on stage, and just start bringing up frequencies in the EQ on the system and see which ones are taking off, and that will help you isolate it as well. And obviously do this before sound check, before the band comes on stage.
Cool. Question from Sean. Go ahead. Let's see. Do you want to ask it, Sean?
Sure. I was just curious if you mix in headphones ever, because I'd assume that these concerts probably get pretty loud, but it sounds like you use your ears so much. I feel like you would have to be listening to the room.
Yeah, I try not to do headphones. When I mixed the boy band Big Time Rush, it was insane. I mean, these little girls, like, 18, 20,000 screaming little girls that never stopped screaming. I came to a point where I'm not going to, damage my hearing because they're louder than the PA for a show that no one cares really how it sounds. I mean, like so I would mix, I actually had the musician's earplugs where I have filters, that it brings the overall dB down evenly as opposed to just cutting out the high end. So I'll put those in, like I'll get the mix going, put those in, and I'll actually pull them out, just to keep checking that I'm not overcompensating anywhere. So I'll do that. Or sometimes I'll put the headphones on and use them, but I try not to, just because I don't want to end up forgetting, like, oh, wait, I'm overcompensating for stuff because I'm using headphones and not actually listening to the room. So.
Interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Thanks, guys. I think we're getting close to wrapping it up. So this is going to be kind of your last opportunity if you want to ask Michelle a question in this real-time mode. So please pop that in right now. I'm not seeing anything coming through. Michelle, this has been really great. Is there any final words you want to leave us with?
Just thanks everybody for coming, and hang in there. Live music is coming back quickly, I hope, and hopefully I'll see you all out there somewhere.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Live Sound Summit, Michelle.
Thanks, Nathan.